We have crises all over this planet, and we have to think differently, because the same type of thinking that got us into these problems will not extricate us from these problems. People think the same way. They think now, you see, the economy's starting to look good. That's what they say. I mean, we see the homeless every day at People's Park. For them, it's just another day. But the economy's starting to look good. That's what they say. The economy's starting to look good. But the reality of it is we're on steroids, people. Economic steroids. A lot of money was infused into this system that was just printed up on paper. We're at $17 trillion national deficit. If you add the liabilities, we're looking at $54 trillion that this country owes. We're in serious problem. And people, what are people doing? It's on the Titanic, and the band played on. People didn't believe the Titanic could sink. They didn't believe it. They thought this ship is too big to sink. And when they hit the iceberg, they were telling people to put their life jackets on. Most of the people wouldn't do it. They said, no, this ship can't sink. Why? Because the headlines, when it was opened and built, it said even God couldn't sink this ship. I mean, that's like naming a spacecraft a Challenger. That's just asking for trouble. Like Muslims, if you look on Muslim airplanes, it always says Bismillah or Ala Barakatillah or Allahumma Sallim. Look on the front of Muslim airplanes in Muslim countries, they always have things like Fi Amanillah. Now, partly that's because they know who the mechanics are. They don't have the same standards. I'll tell you something. I always look at Americans on airplanes. They read books all the time, but they're reading books like, Stephen King or something like that. But you go to Muslim countries, they're always reading books, but it's the Quran. It's the only time Muslims read, because they're on Egypt Air or Pakistani Air. They're just praying that plane gets there, because they know what the airport looked like. And so they know what the mechanics probably look like too. Am I making this up? I'm not making this up. It's scary. I once flew on Air Afrique. Air Afrique, African Airlines. I was shaking the entire journey. When we took off, one of the people sitting in it, the seat just fell back. He was in economy class, but he had a bed. That's a true story. We have to think in a different way. I'm telling you, we need to think differently about this situation. People don't think of the consequences of their actions. And they think somehow that technology is going to improve things. People thought, for instance, I'll give you one example of an improvement. They used to have bare-knuckle boxing in America. Bare-knuckle boxing. You got up and they would do this like this and punch. It was very bloody. There was a lot of blood in the boxing. And then somebody thought, you know what? Let's put padding on, and so we can punch people and they won't get hurt because the padding's there. There have been more mortalities since those gloves were introduced than before. The reason being is that they punch much harder because they think, because they have the padding, it's not going to affect them in the same way. The same is true rugby, which doesn't use any. Rugby is a British version of football. Rugby, they don't use helmets. They play it in South Africa. When they play rugby, there's actually less of the major accidents in rugby than there are in football, because football players are under the illusion that they have this protection. So they run headlong, and before they know it, they've severed their spinal cord. Things that appear to be solutions are often actually creating more problems. And this is much of what the type of thinking that we have out there today. Now, I would argue, because I've thought a lot about this over the years, I would argue, I used to think that the Muslims had a spiritual problem. That's what I thought. I thought, this is spiritual. And then I realized it's not a spiritual problem. The Muslims, I would argue, I've been all over the world, they are the most theocentric people I've ever seen. God is still very much part of the average Muslim's life. They still have all the sayings, Alhamdulillah, Insha'Allah, MashaAllah. We used to have those in this country. Goodbye used to be God be with you. That's where goodbye comes from. God be with you. Now it's just goodbye. People used to say Godspeed. My father still says that, because that used to be an old expression, Fi amanillah. Go with God, Godspeed. But these have diminished. People did not eat in this culture without saying grace. Bless us, our Lord, for these gifts that we're about to receive. There's still people to say grace, but it's not a norm anymore. People just eat. Muslims still say Bismillah. And then I thought, okay, well, the problem is despotism. You have these horrible tyrants. That must be the problem. Get rid of the tyrant. And this is a lot of the Arab Spring is about this, trying to remove the tyrants. But that just opens up a whole other can of worms. And a whole other set of problems comes in. I have seriously come to the conclusion that there are two fundamental problems in the world today. Two, and only two. The first one is in how we raise our children. It's just child rearing. It's the way children are treated. And I believe this is at the essence of the human problem. The way children are treated as young people. Little children. I saw yesterday a horrific, children, you see them you wonder where, in this country you have to have a license to own a dog. But anybody can have a child. And I look at some of these children, I see them in the grocery stores, in other places. I saw a child yesterday, I wanted to wring that man's neck. When you see a 2 or a 3-year-old child screaming bloody murder, that is not the child's fault. They're not in any rational mode. You can't tell them, shut up. And they don't understand those things. And you see so much out there. And I'll tell you, if you want to read an amazing book, it's called Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. It's a great book, really worth reading before you leave the world. There are many books that you can do without. But there are certain books that you can do without them, but you will be enriched by reading them. Dostoevsky is one of those, because he deals with a lot of the modern problems. But I believe at the root of that book is an understanding that at the root of the human crisis is the way children are treated when they're young. And I believe in many Muslim countries there is so much child abuse. We are abusive in the way we raise our children. I'm talking about Muslims. Now, America, I believe, is also abusive. I'm not saying that the way children are raised here that's another extreme over here. It's another way of being abusive. One of the things that my mother, when she raised, first of all, my mother doesn't talk a lot. She's a listener. She's always been a listener. She doesn't talk a lot. But what she taught us was always by example. She was recycling in the 1960s. Like, in those days, you had to bundle things up, put it in your car, drive for 40 minutes to the recycling center. Because recycling started in the Bay Area. She was our house was green in 1970. She used all biodegradable products. When I was 6 years old, we marched the day that Martin Luther King marched in Selma. My mother marched with the people that were marching here, and she took all her kids with her. And I remember that. It's in my mind. And that was at the early part of the civil rights movement. She was right there. She went out. Vietnam, she protested against that, went to all the marches. She volunteered. She was a volunteer on the homeless committee in Marin County. My two sisters, Patricia and Mariah, both went to an all-black school, because in this country, even though you did not have the type of segregation on the West Coast that you had in, say, the South, you had socioeconomic segregation. So you did not have black students in white schools and vice versa. So my mother thought we should do something about that. So she used to drive the kids, and they were enrolled in an all-black school. So our house was fluent in Ebonics, because my sister spoke fluent Ebonics. And there's a picture, her class is all black kids, and then there's this one white girl. And that was because my mom felt we should integrate. And if the state's not going to do it, then we should do it ourselves. That is teaching by example. Now, one of the things I'm going to tell you about Muslims, the second crisis is a crisis of understanding. Fiqh. Fiqh does not mean that there's 7 wajibat in wudu, or there's 11 mandubat, or 14 fada'il in this, that, or the other. That's not fiqh. Fiqh is understanding. Men yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fid din. The one that Allah wants good for, He causes them to have an understanding of the religion. The faqih in the Arabic language was the man that could discern a pregnant animal before anybody else. In other words, they could see what was inside. They could see the batin of a thing, the essence of a thing. Fakhruddin al-Razi argues when Allah says, "Allama Adam al-asma'a kullaha," He says, this is not the names, that He just taught him the names. Where would the significance of that be if it was just the names? He said it was the meanings or the essences of those things that He knew that the angels didn't know. He understood the universal in the particular. He understood the essence of the thing. That is understanding. What is the essence of the problem? One of the great Americans, Thoreau, said, for every 100 people hacking away for every one person addressing the roots of a problem, there are 100 people hacking away at the branches. This is our crisis. People don't see the root of the problem. The Prophet ﷺ, he always went to the root of the problem. When they asked him, when he said towards the end of time, you would have the nations eating your wealth like people come to a plate. They just consume it. And they said, أَمِنْ قِلَّتِنَا يَوْمَئِذٍ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. Is it because we're few? They were asking about themselves. They didn't say, is it about them? Because they were taught by the Prophet. So they didn't look for problems outside of themselves. They wanted to know, what's the problem with us? But they were looking at the logistical level. They were looking at the material level. They weren't looking at the spiritual level. He said, no, you're multitudes, but you're froth. You know froth? You're ghutha. There's nothing there. You reach in and you're not substantial. You're not substantial. That's your problem. And then he said, the reason for that is wahan. Wahan is weakness. They asked him, what is that weakness, Ya Rasulullah? They want to know what the weakness in the heart is. It's not logistical, it's a spiritual. There's something going on here. He said, حُبُّ الدُّنْيَا وَكَرَاهِيَةَ الْمَوْتِ. Materialism, and in one riwayah, كَرَاهِيَةَ الْقِتَالِ, which I prefer because it indicates the dislike of struggle. You don't want to struggle. You don't want to fight. And I'm not talking about martial fighting. I'm talking about real spiritual fighting. Rumi has a story about a man from Qazwin. You know, Qazwin was a great center of learning. A man from Qazwin, he wants to have a tattoo. So he goes to a tattoo. Muslims used to do that, tattoos. That's why it's haram, because people do it. Nothing's mentioned in the hadith about things people don't do. There's only things people do. So he went to the tattoo artist. He said, I want a tattoo. He said, what kind of tattoo? He said, I want a lion. Wow. Want a lion. Put a lion on my back. So the man, the tattoo artist, he starts putting the needles in. He said, ow, what's that? He said, that's the ear. He said, no, make it a lion without an ear. So he said, okay. Then he starts poking again. What's that? He said, that's the mane. He said, no, make it a lion without the mane. And then he said, okay. He starts poking again. What's that? He said, it's a tail. He said, no, I want a lion without a tail. And then the man said, listen, brother, even God didn't make a lion that looks like that. I can't do anything. Rumi, what he says is, people want spiritual. They want to become